Hey, T&B Youth Group. I hope you are having a good week so far. I know many of you are adjusting to doing school at home and to a new routine, and I hope that's been going well for you. Just a reminder, I know I've said this before, but I'm here for you. If you need any sort of encouragement or any sort of prayer, feel free to text me or give me a call. I would love to do that for you. I want to let you know that this next week, our Zoom youth group hangout is going to be different. Normally, we would do it on Sunday night at 7:30. Well, this coming week, since Sunday is Easter, I want to set that time aside for you to be able to spend with your family. And so instead of Sunday night, we're going to do our Zoom youth group hangout on Monday night at 7:30. So I invite you to be a part of that. I'll be sending out the link via Remind and GroupMe, and I'll send an email to your parents so that you could join and be a part of that. And again, feel free to invite a friend if you want your friend to join in for that. I know many people are seeking connection and interaction at this time because we are all isolated and missing out on that. So if you have a friend that could benefit from that, invite them to be a part of our youth group time together. That'll be Monday, 7:30. Join us for our Zoom youth group hangout. Well, Easter is going to be a little different for many of us this year. Many of us often would spend that weekend at LTC, and LTC is not happening this year. And probably some of your family traditions maybe have been changed or disrupted. That maybe some of the people you normally would gather with or some of the places you normally would go, that's not going to be able to happen this year. But even though Easter may look a little different this year, there is one part of Easter that cannot be taken away from us. And it's the most important part of Easter, and that's that we get to celebrate what Jesus did for us at the cross and that he rose from the dead. And so I hope that you spend some time focusing on Jesus during the season, and I hope that you just seek to celebrate what it is that he's done for us. Well, many people use this week leading up to Easter as a time to focus on what Jesus did and to focus on his week leading up to the cross. So I want to help you focus on Jesus tonight, and we're going to look at one story from his week leading up to the cross. So the night before his death, Jesus eats a very important meal with his disciples. They eat the Passover meal together. And the Passover meal was the significant meal that the Israelite people would eat every year as a way of remembering how God had saved their ancestors from slavery in Egypt. And so it was a reminder of how God had saved them and delivered them in the past. And obviously God is at this Passover meal now with Jesus and his disciples. God is starting to do something new. That he's going to rescue his people once again in a more significant way through what he's about to do with Jesus. Well, Jesus does something at this meal that I'm sure his disciples never forgot after that moment. We're going to look at that. We're going to look at John chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. John 13, 1 through 5. I'm going to read it for you. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave his world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So Jesus washes his disciples' feet, and that may seem a little strange to us because that's not really part of our culture. But in their time, in their culture, that was a customary thing to have your feet washed before a meal. Obviously, they would do a lot more walking than us, and they'd have dirtier streets. They didn't have cars to get around in. And so oftentimes their feet would be very dirty, and their tables would often sit lower to the ground, and so they'd almost be reclining or kind of in a lying position where your feet were closer to the table. And so you don't want dirty feet near where you're eating. And so it was customary for a host, whenever you would come into their home for a meal, that often they would offer their household servant to come and wash your feet. Well, in this moment, there's no servant available to wash Jesus and the disciples' feet. So who's the one who's going to be taking on that role? It could have been one of the disciples. One of them could have stepped up and done it. Maybe the tax collector is deserving of washing people's feet. Maybe it should have been one of the fishermen. They were used to dealing with stinky feet. Surely they could have done, or stinky fish. Surely they could have dealt with stinky feet. But none of them stepped up to do it. But rather Jesus, the one really who is most undeserving of that role, he's the one who's willing to take on the role of a servant. And I think it's interesting as we read the passage, there's three things that it talks about Jesus knowing that the disciples did not know at that time that I think makes that act more significant. One, in verse 1, it says, Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. So one of the things he knew is that he knew his time had come, that he knew what was about to happen. He knew that the next day he was going to face being arrested and put on trial and beaten and suffering on the cross and dying. He knew that was what was about to happen. And I don't know about you, I think sometimes when I know that I'm about to go through a really tough time, I don't know, I can get very self-focused at that time, and I'm not thinking about how I can serve other people, but rather I'm thinking about myself and what I'm about to experience. But rather in this moment, Jesus uses this time to serve others. I think that's really significant. It says that he also knew that the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot to betray Jesus. So he knew that one of his disciples, Judas, was going to betray him. So even though there's this one who was going to help send him to his death, Jesus still washes his feet. Jesus practices literally loving his enemy in that moment. And then it also says in verse 4, starting in verse 3 actually, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So Jesus knew that God had put all things under his power, that he had given him authority to do what he wants to do at this moment. And so with all this power and all this authority, at this moment, Jesus chooses to wash feet. That doesn't line up. That's not normally what we think of when we think of people in power and authority, of what they choose to do with that power and authority. But Jesus uses it to serve others. Let's continue reading. John 13, 6 through 11. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, Unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then Lord, Simon Peter replied, Not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Jesus answered, A person who has had a bath need only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. Could you imagine being one of the disciples in this moment, and just how uncomfortable or awkward it would have felt for Jesus, your teacher and your master, the one that you've put your trust and hope in, and the one that you admire and believe is the Messiah, the Son of God, that he's getting down and washing your feet? I would imagine many of us would have felt like Peter at that moment, who says, no, you can't wash my feet. That what you're doing for me is really what I should be doing for you. Jesus was a master teacher. I think a really good teacher, they understand that sometimes the best way to teach something is to model it. And here, Jesus does something for disciples that I think they're never going to forget. As he washes their feet, and they feel this discomfort and this awkwardness of, man, my teacher is on his knees washing my stinky feet. I think that stuck with them. And I think that reminded them that they can take on that role of a servant. That if their master is willing to do that, then so should they do that as well. So that's what Jesus says at the end of the passage, John 13, 12 through 17. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So Jesus encourages them to follow his example. So now wash one another's feet the way that Jesus did for them. And I think he's talking about more than just the actual act of washing each other's feet. I think he's saying, take on the role of a servant. Be willing to place the needs of someone else above your own, to be selfless. And so Jesus encourages them to follow his example. He says, if your teacher has done it for you, then for sure you should be willing to do it for one another. And at the very end, he says, if you do these things, you will be blessed. That there's blessing that comes along with taking the role of a servant. Well, as we focus on Jesus during this Easter season, yes, I encourage you to spend time with him in prayer, and I encourage you to read the Bible, to read the story of Jesus and what he did for us at the cross, about his resurrection. But I also encourage you to follow Jesus' example by serving. That if you want to understand Jesus more, if you want to be more connected to him, take on the role of a servant. So think about, how can you do that this week? How can you give of yourself for others? Maybe it's taking on chores around your house that you normally don't do. Maybe it's volunteering to do your siblings' laundry. Maybe it's helping with some of the meal preparation for Easter. Or maybe you could write some encouraging notes to some friends or to some of the people in the youth group. But find a way that you can serve this week. And I think it'll help us better focus on Jesus and better be like Jesus. Well, you guys have a blessed week. I will see you on our Zoom call on Monday. See you.